Yeah. Okay. I've got 6:30 on my watch, so we're going to be starting on page 5 where it says the English Revolt. Let me just kind of quickly go over some of the key points from last time real quick. The Anabaptists, here again, the atmosphere there in what is now called Switzerland was more conducive to the Reformation. And so at first these people that we call the Anabaptists were just kind of part of that mix down there with Ulrich Zwingli and all that sort of thing. But they came to the position that infant baptism was a false doctrine, and they believed in what we call believers' baptism. And apparently Zwingli was sympathetic with that position until he found out that would lose him the support of the city government there in Zurich. And another thing then, and it's kind of closely tied to the whole idea of infant baptism, because we have to kind of look at, in all these cases, the state, the monarchies, the kings, the princes, whatever you want to call them, the government, did not want religion outside of their control. And so the Anabaptists, on the other hand, contended that earthly power commanding religious matters was contrary to the Word of God. And so they believed in complete religious liberty and no established church. And of all these denominations that we're talking about here, they were the only ones that were never the established church. And if you, and I would say that would be very consistent, with the Christians in the first century. And eventually they married the government, with Constantine and all that. But so eventually what happens here is that the Zurich government condemns the Anabaptists, and they order Anabaptists who refuse to recant on their belief in believers' baptism to be drowned, because they said that was like a third baptism. And now the Anabaptists are not all that numerous if you look at them just as at people today that call themselves Anabaptists. But the ideas of the Anabaptists we're going to see show up in, not surprisingly, Baptists, but also Congregationalists, Quakers, Moravians, and Mennonites especially. The Mennonites today still consider themselves Anabaptists, even though they don't go by that actual name. And now, one important effect of the Anabaptists was that it attached the Lutherans to the Prince-ruled territorial churches and so forth. The one thing that happened was the Munster Revolution that really caused a lot of damage to the image of the Anabaptists generally. It was a small group. They did not represent Anabaptist thought, but they believed in this kind of, they rejected the Catholic view that we would now today call all-millennialism or whatever, because they believed that the Christ was not going to rule through the church, but was literally going to rule himself. And so this group decided, well, they'll help Jesus alone. And so they would take over the city of Münster, Germany, and it was very a violent deal and all this. And so many people had this idea that the Anabaptists were all violent and extremists and radicals and revolutionaries and so forth. Well, after that, Menno Simons comes along. He was a leading Anabaptist, and he took the belief, forth the belief of pacifism, that Anabaptists were already pretty well withdrawn from being involved in society, in organized society or government. They weren't really anarchists in the sense that they philosophically didn't believe there should be a government. They just didn't think they should have any involvement in it, okay? So Menno Simons kind of attaches pacifism to that. And so this was a way of sort of removing that stain of what happened at Münster, Germany from them. Now, and then I talked last time, if you remember, the Mennonites still exist today. In western Oklahoma, you had a fairly significant number of Anabaptists, Mennonites that came to during the land runs and that sort of thing. And then in World War I, they got into a lot of trouble because of their pacifism, because there was two things, not only pacifism, but also they were Germans ethnically. And people just didn't believe, they didn't want to fight, that they were really against fighting Germany, that they had a loyalty to Germany. And they were really horribly persecuted, mistreated in Oklahoma during that time. And then we talked about John Calvin. And here again, you go down there to, he does a lot of his work in what is now called Switzerland. And because of that, the average person that knows anything about John Calvin probably thinks he was Swiss. But he was French. He was born in France. And he was around a lot of the Lutheran teaching at the universities. You know, the universities back at that time were places where people actually discussed ideas, you know, and sometimes that's not always the case today, but at that time there was a lot of this discussion about this whole thing, and Calvin really didn't have much interest in it. He wasn't an atheist or anything like that. He just didn't care. And then he has a sudden conversion, and he becomes not only a leader, but probably the most notable Reform theologian. He taught salvation was all of grace, and that man neither initiated nor could resist salvation. One of his famous quotes, paraphrase it here, he said, "You'll never have Christ's righteousness by clothing yourself with your own." That you have to clothe yourself with Christ's righteousness because you don't have any righteousness of your own. When he was only 26 years old, he wrote the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, and that's where he systemized. That means he kind of put all his beliefs kind of together. He expanded this till his death several years later. With the emphasis was on the glory of God, the sovereignty of God, and so forth. He is evidently a very accomplished speaker. He became a Bible lecturer in Geneva, eventually a preacher. He never held a government position, but he held tremendous influence over the city council. And then, of course, you know, they have elections. And evidently there were some people probably there in Geneva that didn't much care for old John Calvin and some of his things about, you know, you shouldn't be playing cards and dancing and things like that. And he lost his majority on the city council, and he got kicked out of town. And not get out of Dodge, is get out of Geneva. You guys that are a little older might know what the reference was there. You know, Matt Dillon would always tell people, get out of Dodge on Gunsmoke. Okay. And then, of course, he goes up, I think in Strasbourg. He's there for a few years. The political climate changes in Geneva. They invite him back, and he lives out the rest of his life there. And he's best known, obviously, for the concepts of predestination and election. And we'll talk more about that later on. But you know, how do you know you're one of God's chosen, one of the elect? And one way is the way you live. Okay, do you demonstrate God's that God is in you, that you've been regenerated? You know, you've been changed by the Holy Spirit. He also emphasized work ethic. Now, John Calvin has been called the founder of America. Now, the reason he's called the founder of America is because the majority of people in colonial America were probably either Calvinists or they were influenced by at least some of Calvin's beliefs. And one of them was this idea that, you know, that laziness was a sign of you're not one of the elect, okay? And so people tended to be prosperous, or make an effort, at least, towards being prosperous. And, okay, so he's there in Geneva, and he stays there, and he did not start a denomination. However, there were several denominations that were the Huguenots were up in France, and then you had the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, and the Dutch Reformed were all denominations that were founded basically on Calvinistic beliefs. And in fact, in America, as we'll talk about later on, the beliefs of the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, and the Dutch Reformed were so close that in America, they went together and formed one mission board, you know, to go out and preach to the Indians and so forth. Okay, that's kind of what we covered last time. Okay, so we're going to talk about the English Revolt. And I don't think it would be too bold a statement to say that if King Henry VIII's first wife had a boy that lived, there wouldn't have been a Reformation in England. And it would have changed the course of history. And if there hadn't been a Reformation in England, the Protestant movement might have died. And so it's just one of those things that happened. In England, the kings had long opposed the papacy in some ways. They had long controlled the appointment of bishops and archbishops and things like that. And I think probably because they got that 21 miles of water separating them from the rest of the continent contributed a great deal to that. As we get into the time of Martin Luther, the ground was planted, so to speak, there in England. John Wycliffe, remember we talked about him, he still had followers. They were kind of underground. It was illegal. You didn't want to say it too loud, but they were called the Lollards, okay? And they were all over England. People that they may not have expressed these views, but there were a lot of people in England that had those views of that salvation was by faith alone. It wasn't through the works, you know, it wasn't through the sacraments of the Catholic Church. And then, you know, there were humanists such as John Fisher and Sir Thomas More were prominent in the country. And even though they were devout Catholics, this whole idea of kind of humanism at that time is not like we think of humanism, you know, secular humanism today. Humanism just meant that you're putting emphasis on some society, you know, as you have it. And another thing is patriotism was more prominent in England than it was in most other countries. Now, why would that be? I think, here again, I think that they were separated by water from the rest of the continent, probably contributed to it greatly. And so that's going to play a big role in the Reformation in England. And if you'll take if you'll see your, this little chart here, 1485, Henry Tudor starts the Tudor dynasty, is Henry VII. He wins the War of the Roses. And I'm not going to go through that whole thing. Y'all probably heard of the War of the Roses, but it was a war that lasted for 3 decades. And many of the leading nobles in England were killed in battle. And Henry VII emerges as the king, and to kind of put an end to the wars, he marries Elizabeth York, who was of the other leading family in the war. And they apparently had a pretty, you know, for the day, for royal marriages, it was a happy marriage. And I know that y'all being good Baptists, y'all probably have never played poker or anything like that, but you probably played cards. You know, you've got cards and and everything. And you know the face cards, the king is Henry VII. And Elizabeth York is the queen in the deck of cards. So, you know, just think about that next time you're playing cards. That's who they have. So, okay, so these two, they get married, and this unites the monarchy in England, and they eventually have 4 children: Margaret, Arthur, Henry, and Mary. Now, Arthur, now let's just go over here and look at Margaret. One of the things, if you were a female from a royal family, your purpose in life was to achieve some political goal for the monarchy by marrying off to somebody, okay? So they marry Margaret off to the King of Scotland, King James IV, okay? And that starts and he's part of what is called the Stuart dynasty over there in Scotland. Now, we'll come back to Margaret later on, and then we'll look at Arthur. Now, Arthur was the oldest son, and he marries Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, y'all probably heard of Ferdinand and Isabella before. You know, they financed the voyage of the guy named Christopher Columbus in 1492. Spain. And so what they do is their marriage unites the 2 largest kingdoms in Spain. And so modern Spain really starts with their marriage in 1469. And so, now why do they get married? Well, this is going to play a large role in the whole thing. Is what is one thing that Spain and England agreed on? They didn't like France. France was the enemy, and so this was an effort to try to keep France controlled. So they marry, and they try to have an alliance between England and Spain. There's no problem, because at that point Spain's very Catholic. Religion's not going to be a problem. England's very Catholic, and so on. Okay, so Arthur and Catherine, they get married. He's 15 years old, and she's 14. And they go off on their honeymoon, and he comes back dead. Apparently, he came down with something very quickly. So, you know, they had a lot of diseases back then that would just come on. And he's dead. And here's this Catherine, a 14-year-old girl in a foreign country where she could not speak the language. And she's a widow at 14. And she wants to go home. But her father and Henry VII don't want her to go home because they need her for this alliance. So they agree that she will marry the second son of Henry VII, and that is Henry. Now she's 14, he's 8. He's 8 years old. So that's not going to happen immediately. So what's going to happen is she's going to wait around for Henry to get to be old enough that he could be a husband. And that's like 7 years. He's 15, and what would she be? 21. Okay? And so they get married, and apparently in the first several years, you know, they had apparently a pretty happy marriage, and Henry, there's a problem though, is that according to Catholic law, canon laws they called it, you could not marry your brother's widow. No problem. The Pope gives a special permission. Now, I've always wondered how you can do that, how the Pope can just give, you know, something that ordinarily is considered sinful, the Pope can say, well, in this case, it's okay. The argument was that Arthur and Catherine had never consummated their marriage because he got sick so quickly, and that was the testimony she gave to the Pope. And so that's one of those little history mysteries and so forth. Well, So Henry marries this Catherine, and everything's hunky-dory. She has a daughter named Mary. But you see, the Tudor dynasty had a really thin claim to the throne, and this is something I just put it this way: the Tudors kind of got into this whole deal, into the line years back, because there was a guy named I might say this wrong, but Jasper Tudor, I think was his name. He was the Queen's wardrobe, kept the Queen's wardrobe. He was in charge of that. And when her husband died, the king, she marries him. So their children now are in the royal line. He's just a guy, okay? And so Henry VIII is very concerned. He's concerned that he's going to die, and they don't have any boys. She had like 4 boys born dead. And so Henry starts saying, God is punishing me for marrying my brother's widow. And so the only way to get rid of that sin is to get rid of his wife. And so he can get another wife. Now, Henry, even though he's a, quote, devout Catholic, he has a lot of mistresses, okay? And he had one mistress that he had a child by named, my mind's gone blank here, but anyway, she was the sister of, I think it's Mary. But sister of a young woman named Anne Boleyn. And when he got tired of her, he noticed this young Anne Boleyn. And so he proposed for her to take over this mistress duties. Well, there was a problem with that. Anne Boleyn had lived in France for a few years, and while she was in France, she came in contact with evangelicals, the Lutheran people over there. She read the Bible she could read French, and she read the Bible in French, and it didn't square up with Catholic beliefs. And so when she comes back to England, she's really, at heart, not a Catholic anymore. She's an evangelical. And the way she read her Bible, she looks in there, she goes, Henry, it says here you're not supposed to have sex outside of marriage. And and he pursued her for 6 years, tried to talk her into being his mistress. And in fact, they were at one banquet one time, and Henry was a very talented guy. He wrote songs and music and all this kind of stuff. And he wrote a love song. And there they are, and he made Anne Boleyn sit there by him and everything, and they were singing it. Somebody gets up and they sing this love song. And when it's finished, you imagine, all these people are all around watching this, and Henry turns to Anne and he says, Anne, if some young man wrote that song about you, what would you say to him? And she said, I would ask him how his wife liked it. And of course, he gets pretty angry about that and everything. But finally, he keeps pressing her, and finally she tells him, says, look, says, if you were free of Catherine, I would marry you, and I'd give you a house full of sons. And Henry goes, that's the solution. He's got to get rid of his wife. And he starts publicly calling her things like his Spanish cow. He's bored with his Spanish cow and all this stuff. And so he asked the Pope. He figures it's going to be a pretty easy deal. The Pope to over and say that marriage never happened. What do you call it? Annulment. It just annulled because it was never legal. The problem is that Catherine's nephew, remember Charles V we talked about? devout Catholic, he's not going to put up with this. And he's got troops in Italy at the time, and he tells the Pope, you're not going to give this permission. So there's the struggle goes on. Henry finally decides he's had enough of it. He appoints a new archbishop of Canterbury, the top churchman in the country, who grants the divorce. And he marries Anne Boleyn secretly in late 1535. Now, has anybody ever seen the movie Anne of the Thousand Days?
Yes.
Okay. A lot of that movie is very historically accurate, word for word. I mean, they have a lot of records of what people said and all that. But it's also mixed in with a lot of Roman Catholic propaganda, and it makes Anne Boleyn look like she was a very loose woman and all this kind of stuff. So that's what they said about her, okay? But she was very devout, as I said, evangelical. And she finally agreed to marry Henry, and of course, what was her promise to him? A house full of sons, you know. And so she's very quickly with child, so quickly, in fact, you can imagine what the Roman Catholic propaganda was at that point. And so eventually the child is born, and the problem is the child is a girl. And he refuses to even kiss his daughter until she has a brother, is what he says. He has to have a son. And so this goes on. See what's the next thing we ought to look at here. They tried real hard to get the annulment and all that, but finally, to kind of make a long story short here, you've got a situation where Henry is still a Catholic. I mean, there's nothing non-Catholic about him. You know, he had, in fact, when Martin Luther was doing his thing, he wrote a public condemnation of Martin Luther. And the Pope gave him the title, the Defender of the Catholic Faith. And that's kind of funny, because he's the guy that's going to take England out of the Catholic Church. Now, all he really did is there were a lot of people that opposed this second marriage. So the Pope issues a bull. Remember, the Pope was big on these bulls that he issues, threatening excommunication. Parliament goes along with the king, and in 1534, they pass the Act of Supremacy that makes the king the supreme head of the church in England. Now, this isn't the Church of England yet. The only difference between the Roman Catholic Church and the church in England is the king's the head of the church in England instead of the Pope. And several monks, priests refused to go along with this. They're executed for treason. Thomas More, who you may have heard of the movie Man for All Seasons and all that, he was beheaded, okay, and so forth. Now, the guy who was advising him to do all these things after More was resigned and then later was beheaded, Thomas Cromwell was his name. And he advised the king to confiscate all the property of the Roman Catholic Church in England, which was a lot of money. And this really made the monarchy in England one of the wealthiest monarchies in the world. And the Parliament, and Thomas Cromwell also got Parliament to pass the Bill of Attainder Act. Now, if y'all are familiar with the Constitution of the United States, there are certain things Congress cannot do in the Constitution of the United States, and one of them is they cannot pass a Bill of Attainder. What in the world is a Bill of Attainder? That is where, you know, ordinarily, if you're accused of a crime, the courts hear the evidence, and you have a jury and all this kind of stuff. Well, in a Bill of Attainder, Parliament just makes the decision. And they named somebody that was going to be executed. So Thomas Cromwell persuaded Parliament at the urging of the king to pass this. Well, Anne Boleyn gets pregnant again. And she gives birth to a boy, born dead. And things aren't going very well now. And Thomas Cromwell, he sees that this is not going to work. So and the king is tired of Anne Boleyn. He's already having his eyes on somebody else at this point. And so Cromwell figures he needs to help the king. And so you can't just execute the queen. And at first they thought about saying, well, Henry said, I think I got it. Henry's pretty shrewd. He goes, I was having a relationship with Anne Boleyn's sister before we were married, so that's against church law. And Thomas Cromwell said, I don't think we can use that excuse again. We can't make a practice of that. So Cromwell had to come up with something, and he came up with this conspiracy theory that Anne Boleyn was plotting to overthrow the king and make herself the ruler of England. Not true. They accused her of adultery. Not true. There's no evidence, substantive evidence that was true. But since the king picked the judges of the trial, you know how it's going to come out. She was found guilty, and she was beheaded in May of 1836 for adultery and treason. And the king didn't grieve too long, though. 11 days later, he marries his third wife, Jane Seymour. Okay? And
that was 1536.
Yeah, 1536. And then, in the course of time, Jane Seymour has a son, born alive, apparently healthy, but she dies 11 days later. So now he's got a son. He's finally got his son, but he didn't have a wife now. And now, before we get into the importance of Jane Seymour here, and if you can see your chart here, you've got Elizabeth over there by Anne Boleyn. You got Edward VI by Jane Seymour. And of course you got Mary, who was by the first wife, Catherine. Now, let's go back to Anne Boleyn, because this is Christian history, this is what this is all about. But you can see how all this intertwines together is William Tyndale. William Tyndale left England in 1524 because he was wanted for a crime. You know what his crime was? He was trying to translate the Bible into the English language, and that was against the law in England. And so he goes over to Europe, and now Anne Boleyn, all this, when she comes along, she's very persuasive. I mean, the king had a thing for her, for a long time, and she starts telling him, you really ought to let the Bible be translated into English. But Henry eventually does that, but not in time to save William Tyndale. William Tyndale goes to Europe, and he gets a printer over there in Europe to print his English translation of the Bible. Now, when you read the Bible, you're reading a lot of the work of William Tyndale. Even though we've had other translations since then, he was kind of the groundbreaking thing. He translated the New Testament from the Greek in 1526, and they started sending the Bibles back into England, smuggling. I mean, it's hard to imagine this, smuggling Bibles into the country.
Isn't there a Tyndale Bible now?
Yeah. Okay, so they go back into England, and of course everybody knows these Bibles are showing up, and they're destroying them every time they can find them and all that. And one of the Catholic bishops is he's so determined to get rid of this, he figures out who the merchant is that's bringing the Bibles in. And he makes a deal with him. He says, look, if you will give me all your Bibles that you've brought in so I can destroy them, I will pay you this. And it was a lot of money. And so the merchant says, sure, I'll do that. And so they destroyed all these Bibles. What the bishop didn't know is the merchant had already talked this over with Tyndale. And Tyndale said that'd be great because Tyndale had all these debts he had to get paid off, and he used that money to print twice as many Bibles as he had printed before. So that was a good deal. Well, Tyndale's luck finally runs out. In 1536, the Catholics capture him over there in Belgium near Brussels, and they burn him at the stake. And as the fires are coming up, his last words were a prayer. Dear God, please open the King of England's eyes. And apparently that's what happened, because before Anne Boleyn lost favor with Henry, she persuaded him to authorize a new translation of the Bible. And his next wife, Jane Seymour, they were Protestants too. And so we start doing it, starts going, and they call it the Great Bible. Now, what was funny about this whole thing is Henry had issued warrants for the arrest and the destruction of Tyndale's Bible. So what Miles Coverdale did is he comes, the reason they call it the Great Bible is because it was real big, okay? And what he basically did was take Tyndale's Bible, put his name on it, and call it the Great Bible, and Henry says, that looks great, you know? And so, so now the Bible begins to be circulated in English legally in England. And that makes a change real quick. When people start reading the Bible and comparing it to, you know, the Catholic doctrine, it wasn't lining up. And so the Pope, at this point, he calls for an attack by Spain and France on the rebel Henry. And so the reaction was that they kind of lax back into a little bit of Catholicism. They had the Six Articles Act, which does things like transubstantiation and denying the cup to the laity. Priests can't get married and all that. And the other thing he does, in concern out of this possible attack by Spain and France, is he goes into a marriage alliance with the sister-in-law of John Frederick, the Elector of Saxony. Now, Saxony was over there in Germany, Lutheran area, right? A Lutheran prince has a sister-in-law that's 35 years old. She hasn't been able to find a husband. Now, the reason she can't find a husband, well, it'll become apparent here, is he sent Thomas Cromwell. Remember Thomas Cromwell? He goes over there to Europe to find the king a Protestant wife, to make an alliance with the German states. And he comes upon Anne of Cleves, and her father bribed the artist to paint a picture of her and kind of just make it kind of a glamour shot, if you will. Make her look a little better than what she really was. And so they take that painting back to England, and Henry signs the marriage contract. And when she arrives, his first words are, "Oh my God, no." you know, and that marriage lasted 6 months.
This is his fourth wife?
Do what now?
This is his fourth?
That's his fourth wife. And she was smart, though. Anacletus was smart. She agreed quickly to an annulment, you know. And so then he marries a fifth wife, Catherine Howard, and she actually did commit adultery, and they caught her, and she was executed in 1542. She was first cousin of Anne Boleyn. You'd think she would have learned something, you know, but then he marries a sixth wife, Catherine Parr, who was Protestant leanings in 1543, and finally Henry dies in 1547. Now, by the time he dies, there were three parties in England. You got one group that supported the king in keeping the doctrine and worship of the Catholic Church while opposing foreign ecclesiastical control. In other words, keep the Pope out, otherwise we'll pretty well stay Catholic. Catholics, who wanted the Pope back in control, that was the second group. And the third group, a Protestant faction that favored greater reform, and they kind of evolved into a group we call the Puritans. Now, they're not called Puritans at this point, but that's what they, you know, they eventually evolved into that.
Question, is
Yeah.
Thomas Cromwell any relation to Oliver Cromwell?
His sister, even after she got married, they kept the name Cromwell because it was so prominent. And so her great-grandson was Oliver Cromwell. So he was like what? What would that be? Some great something uncle. So now, at this point, Edward is King of England. He's only 9 years old. Okay, now, since he's King Edward VI, he's the King of England, but he's only 9 years old. And under English law, if you're under a certain age, you would have what is called a Regency Council set up. And since his mother was a Seymour, remember, the Seymour family was the head of the Regency Council. The Duke of Somerset, and his uncle, the uncle to Edward VI, was called Lord Protector, and so forth. And he was a strong Protestant. He was a believer in religious and political liberty. And England became a pretty free country during that time, okay, relatively speaking. And Parliament in 1547 gave the cup to the laity. The 6 Articles, remember them? They were repealed. It's too Catholic. Priests could now marry. The Book of Common Prayer was made a requirement in the churches. Largely the work of the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and services were conducted in English.
But they still have the Church of England?
Yes, this is the development of the Church of England at this point. And now, Somerset, remember him, he's running the country in Edward's name, and he wants the king to come up with a marriage. Now, he's not ready to get married yet. He's only 9 years old, but they're always thinking ahead, okay? And there's a little Scottish princess up there named Mary, who's a cousin, a relative, but that was no big deal to them, you know. I mean, they married cousins all the time and everything. And that was, they were plotting out this marriage, but the King of Scotland, James the Fifth, James the Fourth, I mean, they weren't very happy about this, and they get into a war. England and Scotland have a little skirmish, so to speak, at the Battle of Pinkie. Now, I don't know why it's called the Battle of Pinkie, but the Scots are defeated, and the Scottish nobles are now mad at England, you know. And so instead of going along with this marriage of Mary, the heir to the throne of Scotland, they betroth her to the heir of the throne of France. Okay, so let's, and you can see your chart there. You can see James the Fifth is the father of Mary, known as Mary, Queen of Scots, and so we'll pick up at that later. But so remember her. There she is, off over there, and now Somerset, however, gets into problems with the large landowners of England because he fought something called the enclosure movement, and that's where they started fencing off the land. And so the poor people didn't have access to this land and all that sort of thing. And so there's a coup d'etat, so to speak. They overthrow the Lord Protector. He's replaced by his brother, the Duke of Northumberland. But they're still Protestants, okay? And the Protestant cause continues under Archbishop Cranmer. 42 articles, Protestant, are approved by King Edward in 1553. At this point, it looks like England is not only going to be Protestant, it's going to be the crown jewel of the Protestant movement. Then Edward dies in 1553 of tuberculosis. A lot of people died of tuberculosis back in those days, and there was nothing they could do for you. He was like 15, 16 years old. And it came on him suddenly, and he dies. Well, Northumberland, who's the Lord Protector now, he has a problem, because if you'll look at this chart here.
Was he still under that Somerset, where was he still young enough where he had to have people?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
I thought at 15.
He was beginning to play a larger role, like in the council. He would be there and he would voice his opinion, and they were getting ready to, turn it over to him. Yeah, but he wasn't quite there yet, but he was getting close. And so Henry VIII, if you'll remember, he has 3 children. Edward's dead now. Now, ordinarily, the boy had precedence over any female siblings. Then once you get past the oldest boy, it goes to the oldest girl. And there's a problem here for Northumberland, is the oldest girl is Mary. Remember, her mother was Catherine, and Catherine was a devout Catholic. Mary has been angry ever since her mother was cast off, and she wants to be the Queen of England. However, Northumberland doesn't want her to be the Queen of England because he was afraid she would try to restore the Catholic Church and take revenge on all those people that had helped her father get rid of her mother. So Northumberland comes up with a little plan that they will get Mary's granddaughter, Lady Jane Grey is what she's known in history, 16 years old. They put her on the throne of England. They proclaim her the Queen of England. And they go after Mary. Mary is on the run. She hides outside of London in just an average person's house that was a devout Catholic, hid her, and they couldn't catch her. Well, as it turns out, they had miscalculated, and the people felt like Mary was the rightful heir to the throne, and so the people supported her. She comes back, and she's able to take over control of England. She has poor little Lady Jane Grey executed for treason. She was like queen for 18 days or something like that. It was a very short period of time. Now you can imagine what happened to Northumberland. He was executed. Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had authorized her father divorcing her mother, he's burned at the stake. In fact, she's on the throne for about 5 years, and she burns over 300 people at the stake. And that's why she's known to history as Bloody Mary. And Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop, he was given the opportunity to recant, and he did. And he wrote out a recantation, and she decided, I don't care, I'm going to execute you anyway. And so when they went to, tying him up, they had the fire already going there, and a little bit. And so he sticks his hand into the fire, and he goes, "This is the only part of my body that should be burned at the stake." And he started cussing the Pope and the Queen, and I don't mean cuss words, but I mean cursing them, that they were of the devil and the Antichrist and all that sort of thing. But it was too late. And so she becomes the Queen, but she probably made England a Protestant country, because not only she did do this, she marries the king of Spain's son, who was a cousin of some sort, Philip II, and that was unpopular because people in England didn't want. They figured if she marries him, then he's going to really put not only Catholicism in England, but Spanish rule of England. And so she's becoming increasingly unpopular. And when a monarch becomes unpopular, the people start looking around for who could replace her. Who's the logical replacement? Is Elizabeth. Now Elizabeth, Edward, and Mary were all brought up together, little playmates, so to speak, although Mary is quite a bit older, in the home of Catherine Parr. Remember Catherine Parr? She was the last wife of Henry. She was their stepmother. And they all got along pretty well, but when Mary becomes the queen, she sees Elizabeth as a threat, her half-sister. And so she starts demanding that Elizabeth convert to Catholicism. And you got to feel sorry for Elizabeth. I mean, here she is, a situation, her mother was executed, and when she was about 6 years old, she was at court, as they call it, you know, at the king's court, and they're all sitting around. And Elizabeth was kind of a precocious little child, and she stood up and said, all these people are standing around. She says, "Father, what happened to my mother?"
Oh.
So what are you going to say? I had her head chopped off, you know. So Henry sent her to live somewhere else, okay? And so she eventually winds up staying somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but when she got to be 14 years old, one of these Seymour people, they had a lot of brothers, okay? One of them sent a letter to Elizabeth, a marriage proposal, when she's 14, okay? And this guy was a real conniver and everything, but she wrote him back and said she was flattered, but she said, "I'm only 14 years old, you know. Let me get a little older so I can make decisions like that," and everything. Well, in the meantime, this guy, I guess, decides he doesn't want to wait around for Elizabeth to get any older. He marries Catherine Parr, her stepmother. Well, Elizabeth she winds up, moving her around to different places. She winds up living with her stepmother again. And there's this guy that had wanted to marry her. This is not a good situation. And Elizabeth would lock her door at night, but this guy had a key to all the doors. And she would wake up and he would be tickling her and things like that. And it was pretty creepy, okay? And there was, Mary made the decision she was going to have Elizabeth executed because she was a threat. And her husband, remember the king of Spain, King Spain's son, who was going to be king himself, he talks her out of it. And the reason is because if Elizabeth is executed, the heir to the throne of England after Mary would then be this Mary, Queen of Scots, who at that time was married to the king, heir to the throne of France. And he was afraid this would combine England and France and that would overpower Spain. So you see all this politics is going on. And he talks her out of it long enough for Mary to probably, she died in 1558, probably of cancer. It came on her pretty quickly, and she dies. And so now Elizabeth is the Queen of England, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. And I've heard people say, Elizabeth was not very religious. Give this woman a break. I mean, here she's been jerked around. They go Catholic, they go Protestant, they go back, and forth. And she got to be very crafty, in her answers to people and all that kind of stuff. But she did favor the Protestants over the Catholics, because the Catholics had called her all kinds of things, none of them good, including illegitimate, only they said other words for her, and so forth. And the assassination attempts began almost immediately upon Elizabeth, Catholics trying to have her killed. And she picks an able advisor. She's pretty clever, as I said. A Supremacy Act says there's no papal authority whatsoever in England. She becomes the supreme governor of the church. The Act of Uniformity moved England to more Protestant worship with an Anglican episcopate. In other words, all bishops in England would be appointed by the archbishop, who would be appointed by the ruler, the monarch. Okay, so the Elizabethan settlement still didn't please everybody. You had the Romanists and the Puritans. She tried to do a kind of a middle way, because this is kind of the way she was. And here's something that's before we leave England is, you had the Great Bible. Remember, that was Henry VIII authorized that. But if you remember, when Mary, Bloody Mary, comes to the throne, she starts burning people at the stake. Now, if you were a Protestant leader in England at that time, and they're burning people at the stake for being Protestant leaders, what would you do? Well, you could change. They got on a boat, and a lot of them went to Europe, okay? And where in Europe do you think they would go? What was a place in Europe that was kind of a strong Reformed hotbed, so to speak? Geneva, Switzerland. So they go there, and they get in with all those people, and so the Church of England becomes more Calvinistic, influenced by John Calvin's views and so forth. And one of the things that happened while they were there is they began to translate the Bible into English. And since the work was done in Geneva, Switzerland, what was the name of that Bible? The Geneva Bible. And so that was published in 1560. And it was the first, what we would call a study Bible with notes. And those notes, Elizabeth was not very happy with the notes, because if you read the Geneva Bible, I've got a copy of it. It's really interesting to read, because they would say things like, just because you're the king doesn't mean that you should be obeyed all the time, and it was all that kind of stuff in there. And but it was the first Bible to be separated into verses, was the Geneva Bible in English. They had done chapters back in the 12th century, in the Latin Bible. But this was, now they started doing it in verses. And so remember, those chapters and verses were not put in there by the Apostle Paul and, and Moses. And that was the Geneva people that did the verses. But, when you think of the Bible, we think of, in England, we think of the King James Version. But the Geneva Bible was the Bible of people like Oliver Cromwell, William Shakespeare. He quoted the Bible a lot. he was quoting the Geneva Bible. The Puritans, you know, John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, he was quoting out of the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was the Bible that was brought by the first settlers of America at Jamestown and at Plymouth. That was the Geneva Bible. It wasn't the King James Version, it was the Geneva Bible. So it played a large role in how people thought about government as well as about religion, because what did it say in there? The king is only the legitimate king as long as he's following the natural law. And all these people read that. You know, and that became widely accepted in colonial America. Okay, then you had the Bishop's Bible comes in to compete with, they didn't much like it, so that was the official Bible of that was used in the churches in 1568. And so you've got all this going on. And so Elizabeth, she rules until 1603. Now, when she dies, if you'll notice, Mary died without a child, Edward died without a child, Elizabeth dies without a child. This ends the Tudor dynasty in England. So, who's going to be the next ruler? Well, what you've got to do is go back to Henry VII, and you'll see him. His daughter, Margaret, remember, was married off to the King of Scotland, James IV, had a son named James V, and James V had a daughter named Mary, who becomes known to history as Mary, Queen of Scots. Okay? And so we're going to look at how this brings into the Stuarts back over into England now. So we're going to go up to Scotland and talk about the Scottish Revolt. And Scotland was a poor country. It's a poor country today. It was backward. It was still very much in the Middle Ages. Had a weak monarchy. Had weak universities. But those people were independent-minded cusses up there in Scotland. You remember the Roman Empire? You know, they stopped at Scotland. They have what do they call that where it separates England and Scotland? Hadrian's Wall. That wasn't built to keep the Romans out of Scotland. That was built to keep the Scots out of Britain. The Romans, they went up there and they tried to take Scotland a couple times, and it was just too much of a problem. They hated the Scots. And then English kings, as you go along, they every now and then they try to take Scotland, and you know it just is too big. Have y'all seen the movie Braveheart? And kind of gives you that. And the King of England made the comment one time. He says, "I tell you what's wrong with Scotland is there's too many Scots." You know, that's the problem. And so they constantly had this fear of annexation by England. And so because of that, the Scots had a natural ally with the French, because the French were always against the English. So you had this, and the King of Scotland, James V, was a nephew to King Henry VIII of England, but he married the daughter of a French king, and this marriage produced Mary, who becomes our Queen of Scots. Okay. Now, Scotland was having the same thing that everybody else was having on religion. We're going to be Catholic or we're going to be Protestant, and so forth. And Patrick Hamilton, we have a famous American who was a descendant from this family named Alexander Hamilton. He preached Lutheran doctrine in Scotland, and he got burned at the stake for it. Now, John Knox then takes over the leadership of the Protestant movement in Scotland, and he had gone to Geneva, where he got in with all the Calvinists, so he becomes very Calvinistic in his Protestant beliefs. and he gets captured by the French and is made a galley slave. They finally release him, and he goes to England and becomes the royal chaplain under Edward VI. So things are looking up, aren't they, for old John Knox? He's the royal chaplain. Now, how hard a job could that be, you know? But then Edward dies. And John Knox wasn't stupid. He knew what Mary was probably going to do to him. So he leaves the country and goes to Geneva. And he's one of the contributors to the Geneva Bible. So when you read the Geneva Bible, it has a lot of the hand of John Knox on it. Well, then he goes to Scotland, and he leads the opposition to Catholicism and French domination. And fortunately for him, he gets the support of many of the Scottish nobles who call themselves the Lords of the Congregation. Those were the Scottish lords who were in favor of the Protestant viewpoint, and it was a very Calvinistic viewpoint, very Protestant, very anti-French. And so where does that leave Mary, the woman we call Mary Queen of Scots? She's married to the heir to the French throne. So this is going to cause her some problems. But then he dies, and so she runs back to Scotland. Well, by the time she gets back to Scotland, and she wants to claim the throne after her father dies, James V. But by this time, Scotland is becoming very Protestant. And here she is. She's a very devout Catholic. They adopted a Calvinistic-leaning confession of faith. This was the beginnings of the Church of Scotland, which we call the Presbyterian Church today. And with ministers and elders holding office with congregational consent. There's not going to be any king telling them who their minister or elders are going to be. They began to wipe away anything that they thought contradicted Scripture. So when Mary comes back to Scotland, they accept her as queen, reluctantly. John Knox wasn't too crazy about it, but the lords of the congregation said, look, you know, she is the legitimate queen and everything, but here's the deal, is her half-brother, James Stuart, the first Earl of Moray, they called him, he's going to be her chief advisor. So they think this is going to be good because James Stuart has been converted to the Protestant viewpoint. Okay, he's a disciple of John Knox. In fact, when James Stuart got married, John Knox did the marriage ceremony. And so he's the leader of the Protestant nobles called the Lords of the Congregation, so they figure he can keep his half-sister in check. Well, they didn't count on this girl being quite independent-minded herself, and so she decides to marry her first cousin, Henry Stuart, known as Lord Darnley, and James Stuart, the first Earl of Moray, tells him, I forbid you to do this. Well, she's the queen. And so they grew up, here again, they grew up together. They were playmates and all that, but they split up, and so she expels Moray from the country after that because she wants to marry Lord Darnley. And she's kind of got a thing for him. She thinks he's really hot stuff, you know, and all that. And even though everybody was against the marriage of the Protestants anyway, she marries him anyway. And, well, yeah, he was very Catholic, and that John Knox was really upset about that. And, of course, that was another reason that her half-brother was opposed to him. Now, okay, I keep saying half-brother. Let me explain to you what that means is James V, his daughter Mary was the daughter of his wife. James Stewart was the son of one of his many mistresses, but it was his favorite mistress. So he kind of had a higher standing and so forth in that situation. Okay, so at this point, Mary begins to suppress the Protestant lords, and there's all this stuff going on. She had a friend, you know, so I've got that in quotation marks. Some people think he may have been more than just a friend. Named David Riccio. He came from Italy, and he was a strong Catholic. And Darnley, her husband, he suspected this Riccio was kind of in with his wife there, and so he was involved in a plot with the Protestant nobles wanted to kill him because they were afraid that Riccio was taking her to Catholic, and Darnley wanted to kill him because he thought that he was having an affair with his wife. And so they decided the time to do it was while she was playing cards. There she was playing cards, and they just come in right in the middle of this and kill this guy right in front of her. Well, and Darnley was involved in it, and their relationship kind of goes sour, but she's already pregnant, and her son James is born. But even though she has a son named James, she begins an affair with the Earl of Bothwell, James Hepburn. Y'all may have heard of Katharine Hepburn. There's some relation there. And in fact, James Stewart, the actor, is related to this family as well. Darnley is killed in 1567. The person they think was behind it was this James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who's now her good friend. And Darnley, he had, let's see, what was it? I think he had smallpox or something, and he was real sick. And he was in this castle, and she went to see him, and she talked to him, and then she left, and a couple of hours later, he's found outside in his night clothes, dead. And so this is a history mystery. This is one of those murder mysteries. And I've even got a book that goes into this whole who killed Lord Darnley. I suspect it was her friend here, the Earl of Bothwell. Now, with him being suspected of killing her husband, what would be the last thing you would think they should do at that point? Get married, and that's what they did. It looked awfully suspicious. And so the Protestant lords of the congregation were looking for an excuse to get rid of her. There was a revolt, and she was forced to abdicate in honor of her son, who was just a little kid, James VI, and her half-brother, remember him? He comes back to rule the country as regent. Mary is afraid she's going to be executed now, so she goes south into England, hoping that her cousin Elizabeth, who is on the throne of England, would protect her. Elizabeth really didn't know what to do with her because she's the heir to the throne of England. Remember how this goes. And she found out that Mary was involved in a conspiracy to kill Elizabeth. There were a lot of these assassination conspiracies against Elizabeth, so she put her in jail. And she was in jail for 18 years. While she was in her jail cell, she was still plotting to have Elizabeth executed, and Elizabeth finally signed the death warrant after it took years for people saying, sign it, sign it, sign it. You need to get rid of her. And she didn't want to execute Mary, but she finally did. Well, so up in Scotland now, Scotland looks like it's going pretty Protestant, doesn't it? Because who's the king? James VI is a little kid, and who's running the country? The Earl of Moray, and he's the regent. And one day in 1570, he went into this Scottish town, and somebody told him, says, "Don't go down that street." And he says, "Why not?" They said, "There's a guy who's going to try to kill you." And he didn't believe it, so he walked down the street, and it was a guy named Hamilton, who was another one of those relatives of our first Secretary of the Treasury, who was a devout Catholic, and shot him with a handgun. Now, what's significant about that? That's the first person in history assassinated with a handgun. So, you know, he had something, you know, got out of the deal. You know, he of course, he's not alive to tell anybody about it, but that didn't change the thing in Scotland. It really, all what happens is when Moray is killed, then there's a regency council, you know, with James VI. There's this regency council running the country, and they're all Protestant. I mean, they're all devout. They're Calvinists. I mean, they raised this little kid to be a Calvinist. But you know, you can raise kids all you want to be something, and he didn't turn out quite what they wanted him to turn out. And he's probably another one of these guys that when he got a little bit older, he probably asked, "What happened to my mother?" You know, that went on a lot back in those days. And well, you know, she got her head chopped off down there in England. Okay, so as you can see here, James VI, when Elizabeth dies in 1603 without an heir in England, the throne is going to pass to James VI, King of Scotland, who is now going to come down to England and take the throne. But he's not the sixth James to be King of England. He's the first. So he's known James VI in Scotland, but what's he going to be called in England? James the First. And and of course, he's known to history as the guy who authorized a new translation of the Bible, which was finally published in 1611. The actual name is called the Authorized Version, but the popular name is the King James Version, which we'll talk more about that later. Okay, you know, that's an awful lot of history in a short period of time. But can you see how tenuous, how close a call it was for Protestantism to survive? All these things had to happen. I'm just throwing this out here. Do you think it was providential that all these things happened the way they did? Yeah. Now, the Catholics, they're sitting back. They're not real pleased with what's happened in Europe. They mount a counterattack, and that will be what we'll cover here next time is the Catholics. It's kind of like, you ever seen the Star Wars series? What was the second one in the original Star Wars series? The Empire Strikes Back, and that's what's going to happen with this.